likely tens of millions of people's villages, homes, livelihoods, and potentially their lives. In fact, he's so well regarded and known in China. One time, a woman came to Middletree. She had heard about what we do here, and she was very, very sweet. She came and wanted to give me a gift because she had, again, just kind of heard about what Middletree does. And she's a Chinese national, and we got to talking. And I said, "Oh, given your background, maybe you know my friend John Cobb." This woman started weeping. So John's influence is a little bit beyond, his fame and influence and clout is a little bit beyond what we would normally think of as, like the Kardashians or someone, who we would think of as famous and influential maybe. And his influence has been also pretty great on me and on Middletree as an organization. Even though, again, John and I are in the same academic field, in the same town, and have attended and been a part of the same schools, I don't know John necessarily through that. I know him on a more personal level. He and I had a mutual friend, a man who was like family to me, who passed away a number of years ago now. And John really helped to shepherd me through that time. And I was also on the verge of submitting my dissertation, and in many talks with John in and around that time, and many since, he and I have kind of shared our frustrations about what the modern state of education is, and kind of how we're a little bit disenfranchised with it. And John really kind of empowered me and gave me permission to leave traditional academia, which I did, and joined up with an independent seminary, which I became the interim president of, that John helped attach to the Claremont School of Theology. And he also, again, in a roundabout way, was very much responsible and gave me the permission to do this wild idea called Middletree. So he's been an incredible support to me professionally and personally. I think if you've never heard him speak before, you'll be surprised about some of the things that he has to say tonight. I think you'll see that John is not only beloved because of his amazing mind, but because of his phenomenal heart. He is really one of the most thoughtful, most kind, sensitive, caring people I've ever known. At 96 years old, he's still one of the most interesting, most intelligent, and astoundingly, like, one of the most motivated and concerned people walking. So I always say when I introduce him, there's nothing I can do to repay him. All I can do is share him with you. So, John?
Okay. Well, I'll double the bribe at the end of the meeting.
Right.
Thank you. Okay. I appreciate this chance, and I'm enjoying the fact I can see you. Sometimes I'm talking with nobody there to listen. I don't feel comfortable that way. Well, my thinking about education is constantly growing, and my experience with Joseph has certainly influenced it. So it's the influence he's speaking of is both ways. And in the field of education, I think his originality is what he makes it happen, whereas I can just talk about it. So I want to talk for a little while first just about why schooling is so extremely important today and how it is so badly failing in its task. And then I want to talk about what we could replace schools with. Because whereas there's lots of talk about reforming schools, there's not enough talk about getting rid of them and doing something different. And of course, that's not as practical. But my guess is that as we look into the next 5 or 10 years, that things that today seem utterly unimaginable are going to become a dime a dozen. A year ago, even, or 2 years ago, we couldn't have imagined making all of the lifestyle changes we have made because of the pandemic. And I think some of the people in Texas might say they're experiencing things they couldn't imagine that they would ever have to experience in this highly and technologically advanced country. But it's just a little foretaste of what's in store for us unless we make very drastic changes. And I think more people realize that now. So to talk about something drastically different is not as totally irrelevant as it seemed a few years ago. Okay, well, first of all, why do I say schools are so important? Well, obviously, education is important. I mean, education in the broad sense is just how a newcomer, a new child, comes to become aware of the world in different ways, develop skills, develop talents, whatever. And you don't want, babies are wonderful, but if your mind will continue to be a baby mind when you're even 5 years old, it would be very disturbing. And if it was still that way at 50, you'd probably have been in an institution for quite a while. So education is something that happens to all of us. Schools play a role in education. And whether they play the best role they could is another question. There was a time when schools played a much smaller role, and they don't have to go back a long way. Most people didn't go to school. I think I could say 150 years ago. I'm not good on history and dates about these matters. But the idea of a public school that people were required to go to developed along with the Industrial Revolution. Prior to that, nobody dreamed of compelling everybody to go to school. School was something for the elite, but not for everybody. But the industrialists wanted people prepared to work in their factories, and schools were developed for that purpose. And then they made everybody go to school. Now, today, we just sort of take compulsory education for granted, but we really do need to realize it was produced for a very specific purpose. And that particular purpose is no longer very relevant. The number of high school graduates who are going to spend their lives doing some very routine work in a factory is in this country has become rather small. So that's what the school is designed to prepare you for. So I'm not sure we need schools anymore, but we certainly need education. But let me explain in another way why schools are so important. In the past, in the West, there were three main institutions that helped in the education of a child. And one of them was the family. And that was, in many cases, the most important. And the second one was the church. And family and church generally worked together. I mean, there were, of course, times when there were tensions between what parents thought was children needed to know and what the church thought they needed to know. But basically, they worked together. And at least some basic values were communicated that way that were probably not sufficiently critical and criticized. And then when schools were created and required, I mean, when they were simply optional, then of course they were important for the people who used them, but not for most people. But public schools came onto the scene as a third factor. And for a long time, in many ways, they also proclaimed basically the same values. Of course, before that recent period, churches had created schools so that the church schools were harmonious in what they taught with family and church. But now there have been great changes in recent times. And although, of course, parents are still a very important part of education, parents have a lot less time to spend. In most families, both parents work. And the parents use the fact that the children are in school to make it easier for them to do their jobs, but then often much of the rest of the day beyond school is still with a child with some kind of a institutional specialist. The child has music lessons or play sports or something else. On the whole, children spend a great deal less time at home with their parents than they used to. So parents can't do. This is not a criticism. It's just if you are extremely busy doing other things, you cannot be as fully present to children or spend as much time with children as you could if that was your primary expectation. And at the same time, and the reasons are all mixed up, of course, churches have ceased to be a major factor in the education of the majority of children. Now, there are sections of the country where that would be less true. And frankly, the churches that are surviving are not the churches that gave the best advice for childcare. So the institution at which the child spends far more time being instructed is the school, the public school. And although obviously I think parents would always have a certain amount of ethics in their teaching of children, some of it, of course, becomes legalistic and cruel. I mean, I'm not trying to say that parental time with children was always ideal for children. I'm just saying it's not as important as it once was because there's less of the time. And the number of children who spend as much time in church and church-related activities as I did when I was being brought up, and I wasn't an extreme case of that, has now really become very few. So we look to the schools to culturalize, and teach everything that needs to be taught. Now, at the same time that schools were becoming more and more important for the cultivation, the education of children, they were confronted with a change in the understanding and definition. It used to be taken for granted that schools taught people what was better and worse, values. But now high school is primarily thought of as preparing you to succeed in getting into a good college. And the professors in a good college have gotten their PhDs in academic disciplines. And academic disciplines pride themselves on being value-free. Academic disciplines were not developed for the purpose of teaching. They were developed for the purpose of preparing people to do research in narrow fields. But they have taken over the teaching profession. So that now a professor in a university is looked down on or even endangered in his position if he's explicit in teaching young people how to decide what is better and what is worse. That's value teaching. Now, this history can be traced in a different way, and I'll just mention it for those of you who have had some history of ideas. Immanuel Kant is the single most influential philosopher in the last couple of centuries. And he taught that you must make a very sharp distinction between facts and values. Now, by values, we might mean the evaluation of the facts. So a fact would be that there was a war. A value would be that that's a terrible thing. So you can teach the facts, but not the values. So we are excluding the teaching of values from education at the time that the family is much less well equipped to do the job, and the church has almost left the field so far as a very large percentage of the population is concerned. So we don't teach values anymore. Children grow up, and the culture that they learn is the youth culture. And I think youth cultures are often quite wise and remarkable, but they're fragile. And culture is something that needs to develop over the centuries and build on the past and not simply be invented. And the situation is actually a little worse than that. I mean, the value I'm most concerned about is the idea that we should serve the community, that other people must, and their interests must be taken into consideration, that we should be concerned for the common good and not just for our own. But when you study the social sciences, especially economics, but nevertheless it pervades much more widely than that, you are taught that people behave selfishly and that anything else is pretense. The desire for money is the only motivation that is recognized in economics departments. Economics is a very important part of university teaching. And if you compare the systematic teaching that there is no real concern about other people, that's something that's a superficial surface appearance, but the reality is it's always a selfish reason for doing something nice to somebody else. So you understand, your academic teaching teaches you that you are an isolated individual who looks out for yourself. Now, along the way, you've learned that some people think it's nice to really care about others, but there's no systematic teaching of that. It's not too surprising if the graduate of a university doesn't really think that caring for other people, adjusting one's own behavior and one's own goals so that others can have advantages, that's not important. It's sad to me that one of the most influential novels of recent times, at one time when Congress people were asked about their religion, half a dozen or what literature they were most inspired by, at least half a dozen of them said Atlas Shrugged. I don't know whether that book is as familiar now as it once was. But Atlas Shrugged, when somebody raised a question about what consequences what he was doing would have for other people, that didn't matter. That's not important. Now, I don't think any parents are going to teach their children that, though there are parents who will teach their children. Now, the important thing is that you succeed. That's not a rare parental teaching. And it can fit very comfortably into the idea of what individuals are. But nevertheless, I'm not saying that parents don't make some effort to persuade their children to care about something other than themselves, something larger. Very difficult for that teaching to compete with an educational system which is based on the assumption that everybody only looks out for themselves. So it's not too surprising that nihilism is a growing phenomenon. And all this is happening at a time when, if we don't really care about our communities, if we don't really make sacrifices for the sake of the common good, the ship's going to go down. It's the timing is as bad as it could possibly be. Now, again, I think there are wonderful things going on in the world, and wonderful things going on among students and among faculty. But the content of curriculum is not negligible. That's an important part. And there is very little attention in any of the academic disciplines to forming people as compassionate people, loving people, members of communities. In the social sciences, you will find that there's very little talk of community, because they don't really think there is any such thing. Well, I hope you get the general picture. In my view, the dominant move in schooling in my lifetime has been the end of the dominance of the liberal arts and their replacement by academic disciplines not designed for education, designed instead for a particular kind of research. That's perfectly reasonable that there be a few people prepared for that research, but such a small percentage of the population. And in the meantime, the one institution that is about values mainly is fading, has much less influence than it earlier did. Now, again, please don't misunderstand. I'm not saying the church was a wonderful thing and schools are bad things. Churches may deserve to die, but nevertheless, it's not good for society not to have somebody helping young people distinguish what is the better way to live. And right now we don't have that. And the schools don't pretend to do it because the schools say they're supposed to be value-free. So I think we're in a very dangerous situation in terms of where individuals come out. The institutions of society don't support what the society needs for its long-term health, even if the world were moving along in a comfortable way. But when now in a single year we have seen crises that are way beyond what we anticipated. Likely that next year will be worse, and that the year after that will be worse, and that the year after that will be worse. What kind of people can survive all of that? I think the answer is where you have strong communities, where people, instead of competing with each other, will look after each other, take care of each other, work together to manage things. there's a chance of survival. But we're spending globally, spending enormous resources, using up what's left of the planet's resources, polluting all over the place, so that we will be able to defeat all the rest of the world by ourselves if we need to. And of course, other countries have to spend a lot of money. But that's about the most wasteful use of resources when resources are becoming scarce. There's going to be massive hunger. Fresh water is already very scarce in many parts of the world, and that's going to be much more true. Even where there is fresh water, the piping system is collapsing. That's a lot of the problem in Texas right now. We just urgently need some way of bringing up our children that helps them understand what kind of a world they're coming into, and that they must work together, think together, support each other. I don't think that we have much chance. Okay, so that's my bleak picture. I could also then talk about the wonderful things that are happening. I think that at the fringes, schools are doing a lot of good things. It's very interesting on a university campus. Often the campus has been redesigned in some ways to save water. Often young people are encouraged to have trips abroad to become aware of what's going on in other parts of the world. Often there are organizations of students and faculty that are trying to do these things. The only place which is value-free is curriculum. So getting a college education has often been very good, but not because of what you study, it's because the rest of your time may be spent. But I think that residential higher education is going to be a much smaller part of higher education in the future than it has been in the past. And all that will be left will be the curriculum. So that's, I can go either way. I mean, I could spend time talking about lots of good things, or I could tell you horror stories that, anyway, I want to spend the next part of the time in giving you a completely imaginary vision of what might replace schooling. Of course, there's lots of improvement of schooling that's possible, and I'm all for it. I work at that all the time. Reform is possible. But if you have an institution whose function is not particularly admirable, and which is, for many of the people who go through it, not a happy experience, which makes a lot of people really feel badly about themselves. I mean, it is appalling to me that a high percentage, something like 20% of high school graduates cannot read and write. That's why preserve a system like that? Well, you might say because that's the only way you can educate. But I don't think compulsion is the best motive for learning. And I don't think that it is a good motive for learning. And Joseph has taught me that almost everybody can learn if they're not under stress. The schools are really set up to create stress. There's always the fear of failing. Okay, what could we replace schools with? So I've been fantasizing about that. And please, I obviously, my fantasies are not entirely realistic, but they might be more realistic than continuing what we're doing now, because at least if they may point the way to survival. Okay, let's say we abolished requirement. There was no requirement to go to school. That doesn't mean that we don't want people to learn. On the contrary, I want to abolish school so that people will learn more. But there would be no, I would say, no requirements, no grades. But there would be lots of opportunities to learn, and opportunities to learn the sorts of things that we learn in schools would just be there alongside of opportunities to be involved in sports, to be involved in music, to be involved in drama, to be involved in charitable work, whatever. And if you did something, it would be recorded. And if what you did was to learn to read, you could get a certification that this person can read. If what you learned was addition and subtraction and multiplication, you could get a certificate. And of course, without a certificate that you could read, you wouldn't be admitted to somebody's lectures or some discussion group where reading was necessary in order to participate. So there would be some things that you had to do if you wanted to do some other things. And potential employers could say, well, if you want to work for me, you have to have the following certificates. So that's another kind of requirement. And the government might say, if you want to vote, you have to have a certificate that says you've had some study that's relevant to your understanding of society. I'm not saying it should, I'm just saying anybody could make requirements relevant to a particular role in society, or to, especially to getting a job of a particular kind. So it's not just total mishmash. You do anything you want, anytime you want. You can't do advanced work without having done some preliminary work. But if you don't want to do anything in arithmetic, you're not required to, but you're likely to find out you're sort of in trouble if you can't keep your record and subtract and add. You know, and that there are practical needs in society that would make almost everybody want to be able to do some things. So they may be required for a normal social life. But still, it would be the child who would decide. Obviously not very young children. My own view is that at the present time, education is pretty good through kindergarten. I think in kindergarten, children are not being pushed. They're not being made to feel their failures. Teachers know that the important thing is that the children feel good about themselves and about what they're doing. And they're right. And they're not preparing to be tested. They're not graded. So obviously, we need, with very young children, to create a context for them. They can't create the context for themselves, and they can't make the choice. But by second grade, I think already you need to tell children, these are the opportunities that you have, and you can choose. And if you want to spend most of your time dancing, learning to dance, okay, you can do that. But you need to take responsibility for yourself and use your opportunities of choice wisely. And you can get advice. There'd be counselors around, but nobody would be sitting in a chair in a class simply because that was part of a curriculum that had been designed by somebody else who doesn't know that child, and simply because some bureaucracy had set it up. In most of the time, the child would be following the child's interests. Now, I'm convinced that it is a natural thing for children to enjoy learning new things. I think it's only at school that can become a chore. But I watch a movie that's about a historical epoch. And at the end of that movie, I want to know, well, now how much of this is true? What happened to this particular person and so forth? I think children react that way too. White had taught you begin with romance and watching a historical film. I don't mean a really historical film, but I mean a film about a historical character that will, of course, have fictional elements to it, but enough historical accuracy that it raises further questions in your mind. I think that it's possible to make all kinds of things available and then let children decide. And that they will learn more, not less. I'm sure that teaching children who want to learn what you have to offer is a much more rewarding experience than trying to persuade them that if they don't learn this lesson by tomorrow, they'll be punished by a low grade. And if they get a low grade, they won't, that's all true, but that's the way society is set up. I think that if you had a society, I mean, if you had a community center that offered many, many things in many, many different forms. Some of them would be lecture forms, and some of them would be discussion groups. And children could decide how they wanted to do it. And they could also do it just on their own. The books would be there also. But the kinds of things we do in school would be treated alongside the kinds of things that people do outside of school. And children could spend more time in sports or music or drama or something else than they do in what are now considered academic subjects. Well, all of this would be during the years that one is in grade school and high school. But some children really enjoy learning some things. There are children who are just born with mathematical gifts at a very young age. But they might they might need something that was way beyond what could be provided in a local community. So I'm not saying that we give up things like colleges. There need to be places where you can get more advanced work. And I think they should not be organized according to academic disciplines, but should be organized so as to help the child develop along the lines the child wants to develop. I'm not going to try to picture anymore. I really, I think we have. Well, we've been going for 45 minutes, so I'm going to stop yakking and ask you if you have any questions about either part of this presentation, either why I am so unhappy that we have a culture which has no institutionalized provisions for developing socially responsible behavior. And I am excited about new developments in learning that would make the children feel much more responsibility than they now. Now the decisions are all made for them and they have to respond to other people's decisions. If they can make their own experiences and pay the price of them, if they're mistaken, but if they end up being good decisions, they can really take great joy in the advance. And it would be very important that much of the learning be done collectively, where they could help each other, work together. Okay, I say I'm going to hush, then I keep going. So do you have any questions?
And you're all muted currently, so you know it's very much the same as Zoom. For those of you who aren't familiar with Google Meet, but you can unmute yourself on the bottom there and just chime in, or you can put something in the chat, or you can raise your hand. You put something in the chat and I can read it to John, or you can raise your hand and we can kind of go at it that way, or just chime away.
Hello, this is Leon. Can you hear me? Leon Heimovich. Thank you. Thank you very much, John, raising all these important questions. I don't see the chat where I could add something. Oh, I do see. Okay, all right. I will do it later. But, you know, about not teaching values in school, I would say that in my experience, they espouse, they say that they are neutral and so on and so on. But in reality, a very large amount of brainwashing going on.
Okay. Yes, I think there's a lot of hypocrisy about that.
Yeah, and an example that I could not find a better one probably is my son who was in 7th grade, and there is somebody from Planned Parenthood who is invited to do sex ed. And she starts her presentation saying, I am not going to push on you any opinions. And then she goes for about an hour of pushing her opinions. And then my son at the end raises his hand and say, I'm sorry, but you were pushing on us opinion for this hour.
Yes.
So he gets in big trouble.
Yes. Well, of course, I mean, I think it would be all right if you didn't have any requirements, that you could have different people giving lectures on different topics that people could voluntarily go to hear, that were taking positions on controversial issues. You understand that I think that any discussion about Planned Parenthood, I mean, about planning your family in a certain way, already assumes, well, you could approach it in a completely self-centered way, or you could approach it in terms of the needs of society. You could approach it in terms of all of the parties involved. And it's at that level that it just seems to me it's very important that we teach people to pay as much attention to the consequences for others as they do to the consequences for themselves. That's the kind of value that is associated with morality all over the world. The argument against teaching values is that you take a side on genuinely controversial issues. I don't think that's wrong as long as it's made very explicit that that's what you're doing and not required. It's when you must take this course, and then you include in the course somebody pushing one thing like that. That's then I'm on the side of being value-free. That means not doing that. But I don't want my children to think that values are not important. And that's really what they're taught in school by the curriculum.
Dr. Cobb, can you hear me okay? Excellent. I tend to generally agree with you that I think that we do a lot at the elementary school level that is right. After all, it's where we learn to be kind and we learn to share and we've learned to play in the sandbox with everybody. What would be your thoughts around the size of kindergartens, or not kindergartens, but elementary schools kind of in general, say K through third grade, where students all largely need the same things, the same basics, the reading, writing, basic math, maybe a basic set of values depending on how that's structured. Is there room, because I've often thought that one of the things we don't do well is that we have a lot of elementary schools and very few high schools, and really maybe it should be inverted, that we should have large elementary schools where the needs are the same. And then by the time students are getting to the high school level, especially if high schools became more optimized, more particular, and even optional, that it's in those smaller environments that we could make them smaller and just kind of more specific. So what would be your thought around having large 2,000, 3,000 student elementary schools?
Well, my interest would be more in the size of the group that the child was learning in.
Mm.
And even though the needs may be the same, the speed at which children pick up the math or the reading and writing is very different. And when they have to go through, I mean, we're often holding back the brighter children, and I think that begins already in third grade. The brighter children already understand the math that the others don't understand, but it has to sit there while that math is being explained. The less of that, the better. If the bright child can just go ahead at the speed that comes, then school would be a joy. And if the duller student is not made to just feel like they just can't do it and get more and more anxious and stressed, I don't think you can expect a teacher to handle all of that if they have 20 students in the class. And that's already small, I guess, in comparison with the reality.
Right, by today's standards, I would agree.
Yeah. I read recently, and of course it's just a throwaway line, but you can tell what children are going to have trouble in life by whether in the third grade they are reading with the other children or not able to do it. And the school is inevitable. I mean, I'm not blaming teachers or something like that. I don't think you hear me in that way. It's just the structure of it is lockstep. You do this in the first grade, this in the second grade, this in the third grade, and whether you ever learned what you were supposed to learn in second grade, you're going to still go to third grade. And your ability to read is not going to improve because you expected to already know how to do that. And the child from that point on is just, school is miserable, makes them feel ashamed. They feel very stressed and helpless. And that's just not the way to educate. And I'm afraid in lots of schools all the way through high school, they just keep promoting them because they don't want to deal with them again. in the same year. But it is still shocking to me that the Army rejects something like 20% of high school graduates because they don't know how to read and write. That's not necessary. It's possible to organize education in such a way that the number who don't learn how to read and write would be 1% or 2%. I mean, there are personal problems that prevent it, but I think Joseph has shown how so many children, when you take the stress away from them and let them do things at their own pace in the way they want to do them, they learn. So I'm trying to imagine this, but I agree with you, probably second grade. I mean, exactly where. Adults have to plan a few years. You can't turn a baby over to make these decisions. But I think already by second or third grade, you need to break the lockstep stuff. Allow bright children to learn what they want to learn and can learn, and help the slow children learn what they can learn.
And I noticed that we have a number of, and I'm not calling them out, and certainly didn't invite them here to ambush them, saying that, you know, we're going to get rid of schools. That's our idea. But we have a number of our Pomona partners here, a number of administrators, a number of principals here who can possibly speak to this as well. And also, you know, we are up against the 7 o'clock hour. We're going to continue talking for as long as Dr. Cobb has you know, the stamina for and care for, but you know, feel free obviously for folks to drop out at any time. There's no offense taken, but again, I'm sure we have, you know, there are some people who could add some color to that discussion with a lot of expertise behind it.
Yes. But one of the problems, though, if you're working in an institution, you can certainly see ways of improving it. But just imagining not having that institution is a more difficult task. But what I'm getting, I mean, I think for teaching, if when you offer a course, the great majority of the students who are taking that course are taking it because they want to take it, it's a lot more satisfying teaching. So I don't feel like this is, and of course, some teachers are very good at lectures and others are better at organizing the students so that they help themselves and help each other. And teachers would be free to create what they wanted to create. And then those students who are attracted to that kind of a situation would take those courses if they wanted to. And a lot of the learning wouldn't have to be in courses that are year-long courses or half-year-long courses. You could have you could have a group that just met for 6 weeks on a particular topic. Or you could have a group of young people who really are interested in current events. And it would be good if they could do it without any teacher. But often having someone there in there who is more familiar with what's going on and can play a helping role and not a dominating role.
I have a question for you, Dr. Cobb. Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm hearing you.
Awesome. So my question is, as someone who is trying to ease my way into the education system, I'm looking at teaching high school biology and, you know, a couple years down the road. I'm just wondering, are there any ways that you can foresee being helpful in sort of pushing our current systems towards this direction that you would prefer to see?
Yeah, that's the problem with just, you know, saying let's start over and imagine we were beginning from scratch. What could we produce, that it's not as helpful to people who are already in a system that, and you have to fit into that system. You know, I think you could talk to Joseph about that, because he taking a lot of the students who are having trouble in their regular classes and creating contexts in which they learn. And of course, that I don't mean that you can just copy that. I mean, you have responsibilities to the school and so forth that might not always meet. But if you realize the extreme importance of students not feeling stressed and anxious, I think you may be able to help them feel comfortable. You still got to give them exams, you see, but that's, I mean, you'll have to give them grades at least. And that, so there's an objective reason for the anxiety that you have a hard time controlling. But the more you realize that students learn when they want to learn and when they are not made to feel pushed, I think it can affect the way you deal with students. But I wish I felt I could really help you. But I think the reason that it's worthwhile just imagining what would be the ideal. You can some aspects of it can be introduced into the present, and I think that may be a way of changing the present. The more teachers are aware that the problems the students are having derive extensively from anxiety and stress. You know, one of the very interesting things, if we could get our school board leaders to visit Finland. You know, the Finnish students do better on international exams than any others in Europe. Now, it happens that they go to school fewer days of the year, fewer hours of the day, and have less homework. That ought to say something to us about the fact that by putting more and more pressure on students, you don't increase their learning. The Finns don't examine their students much. So if we just understood that the climate, a climate in which students and teachers are working together to answer the questions people really have, they learn more. And it's objectively proved year after year by the fact they do better on exams. Now, Joseph was mentioning that I do a lot more in China than I do in the United States. At least I've had people pay more attention to me in China. Maybe that would be the way to put it. But the Chinese schools are worse than ours. They copied us. But we at least had a background of liberal arts education that we haven't given up completely. They don't. Memorize, 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 memorize for the exam. That's what education is. But they don't learn to think. They don't learn to write papers that can be published in American journals. This is a very specific problem. Because we do have a little bit more sense of helping students to read and write out of their own experience, their own relationship to the subject matter. They don't get that. But I'm afraid we're heading in their direction rather than they are heading in our direction. So
That's very interesting. Very interesting about child.
I don't know what I would do, but I think I should take them out of the school and teach them at home so that they wouldn't have those emotional obstacles to learning. But I'm such a believer in groups and communities that if students are isolated from everybody except their parents, you're teaching them something else that I don't like. So I just say I have no general answer to that. I don't think there's anything wrong. I think some children flourish and can still find plenty of time to play with other children and have a good life, but there are more, that's a whole new set of problems, a different set of problems. So I would like to imagine that we could experiment with radically different systems. And I'll tell you a very sad story for me about what happened in China 20 or 25 years ago. I mean, the Chinese know this is a problem. It's not, when I scold them, they know, they agree with me. But what do you do about it? Well, the government employed a woman educator. She happened to be a Whiteheadian, to come up with a different curriculum that would not be oriented to memorization, but to thinking and understanding and developing wisdom. It's possible to do that even in a lockstep school, though the lockstep is also a problem. Yeah. And she was getting, I said, well, how many children were involved in this experiment? And I just find this amusing. 20 million. Numbers in China are just so huge. But after about 6 months, the parents noticed that their children were not memorizing as much. And they became fearful that they wouldn't do as well on the exams. And the national exams really determine your future. If you succeed, you are destined for the middle class. If you fail, you're destined for the worker class. Now, I don't blame parents for really caring a great deal about whether their children succeed or not. And of course, the new curriculum was not preparing people for that kind of exam. Now, I think they might have done very well, but I can understand they weren't going to take that risk. So the parents massively protested and the whole venture ended. So you can't change the system the way that they teach unless you get rid of the exam or dramatically change it. And they haven't figured out how to do that. It's not easy. Now, we don't have anything as rigid as that, but I think we do have a kind of sense that there are some exams, national exams, that have a lot to do with whether you go to college or not. And going to college is what gives you a shot at the middle class. If you don't go to college, you're almost destined not to get a middle class job. So our situation is similar, as I say, that we still have a lot of teachers who themselves are much more oriented to a liberal arts kind of style than to the academic discipline style. And so there's still a lot of teachers who really take interest in the individual students. I mean, it's much more humanized than their system. So I'm not trying. I mentioned this just to indicate. I think we're heading in the wrong direction in our academic system. you see, there's no place you can get a PhD to teach preparing you to teach liberal arts. All PhDs are now offered in academic disciplines, which are not really oriented how you teach, or what happens to the student. And I'm afraid that the softening of the negative consequences due to an earlier generation that was taught to care about the students and to think that you really wanted them to learn, and that was the reason, that fades, and that this value-free stuff, I mean, Harvard University, I don't think they're so proud of it, but they do describe themselves as a value-free research university because the disciplines are value-free. They're set up. I don't mean no teacher could squeeze some, but the values they teach are that values are not important. And that, in fact, everybody is selfish and there's nothing you can do about it. And I think that's about the worst teaching you could have. And I'm not suggesting any of you teach that, but nevertheless, if you follow your academic course and stick very carefully to what is required of the discipline of biology. You see, biology could be taught as a liberal art. I'm not saying you can do it. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to push you to do something. But biology is a liberal art. Your questions would be, what do these kids really need to know about the human body and the ecological system?
In the meanwhile, I think that John introduced very interesting and important distinction between fearful parents and caring parents. And quite often it kind of the same, but in the reality, these are the opposites. And what I would be really interested in, how do we produce from caring parents so many fearful parents?
Yeah.
And actually, I think some of the answers will be given during the talk tomorrow, and I put in the chat about rebalancing society. This link, and it might be interesting, but I would really like to hear what people here think about what happens. How do we here or in China have so many fearful parents?
Yes.
When they start as caring parents.
Yeah. But you know, I've been painfully aware of how we greet the baby when the baby is first born. Now, in almost all cultures, the newborn baby is handed to the mother who holds the infant to her breast. And in many cultures, the infant never experiences until much later in life complete isolation. But we take, I mean, I'm not sure, I think this has improved, but I'm talking about when I was having my children. They were taken from us and put in bassinets in a room all by themselves, and they cried, but nobody attended to them because they were crying. They just made sure they got enough food. For a week, the newborn child is living in a way exactly the opposite of what they want and need. Now, I grew up in Japan, and it was interesting that if we were on a train in Japan and we heard a baby cry, we would say, oh, there's Westerners on the train. Because Japanese babies don't cry. Why should they cry? And the parents learn if their young child, say a 1-year-old child, bothers a neighbor, they learn how to distract them. in the US, there are people who think their child needs to learn discipline by the age of 1. Some things they learn now, they must not do this. The Japanese mother would never say no to a child at that age. So I think that we begin very early to misdirect. And if school is simply a continuation of that misdirection, it's not too surprising that the next generation of parents is not much better. I'm specifically interested in this parenting business, the birthing business, and I think there are more people now who are having their child at home and then keeping the child, and not allowing themselves to be separated. My wife and I were separated from our twins for a month. I'm still angry about it. For the first month of their life, they had almost no physical contact. That's utterly cruel. But because we prize the physical health and protecting them from germs more than what they prize, and I think the same kind of attitude, we know what they need and we will teach it to them whether they want to learn it or not, tends to play a role in our school system. And I think, well, the mayor of Pomona told me he was troubled about the way in which bad parenting produced a new set of adults who would be bad parents. Could we intervene? And Joe is starting to work on that. And I don't mean there is no one else working on good parenting, but it's not a major topic. Schools are, of course, oriented to the children, not to the parents of the children. But the child will probably, if the parents don't understand what their job is, it's very difficult for school to compensate, especially if schools don't know what their job is either.
John, you'll be happy to know that 2 people in this call, Brissia and Evelyn, and I are meeting with Pat tomorrow, having our second meeting about that parenting happening in that course.
No, I'm delighted that I think Pat has had the experience of good teaching of this before, and you have the context that is just what is needed. So I'm hoping that you will not only have a successful experience, but one that will catch on in other people. I think there are quite a few people who do know what good parenting is and could help a lot.
Marcella asks, John, do you think public schools will change?
Well, my fear is they'll get worse. Because there's a lot of anxiety in the whole society. And the anxiety, oh, these children don't know how to do X. We got to make them do X. Well, they're not improving. We'll have to add 2 weeks to school, cut down on summer vacation. I mean, that kind of thinking, that's why I wish people would go to Finland and find out how it is that less is more. So there's that danger, that the more tense the atmosphere becomes as we face crisis after crisis, that the tighter the grip we feel the need of making. But that's not necessary. I think even adults are able to learn. The evidence is all that we have adopted the notion that to get children to learn, you must make them fearful that they will fail. If they don't do what they're supposed to do, they will fail. That fear is a major motivator used in the schools. And it's no better for children of that age than it is for younger children. But there's
say
still
that fear-
lots of teachers who love their kids. That's why there are redeeming. Not everything is as bad as I'm saying. I just think that the institution works against the good rather than for the good.
And that's exactly the word, institution. And I think what happens is, when people are so anxious and in fear, and that's a big problem, you can really manipulate them easily.
Yes.
And the dominant force that is directing people now is economy. Those 2 additional weeks in school are additional jobs, additional income. And that, rather than interest of children, that will win.
Yeah. Yes. In this country, at least, there's still possibility of alternate experiments. I think that the fact that we can have private schools paid for by the state could be a source of wonderful experiments, but I'm afraid it's just another source of making money for the private sector. In general, I mean, again, there are exceptions, and when I have written about this, I've spent a lot of time on the exceptions. There are very recently at the University of Louvain, I'll claim a slight amount of credit for it, but mainly it goes to Richard Rose and other faculty members. They have developed a program leading to the BA degree that is related to the real needs of the world and society. Now that's shocking. You're not supposed to teach something that's relevant. Academic disciplines don't do that. But for a college to say, okay, that may be academic disciplines, but we think it's important that at least a few children learn how to be helpful to society. I think that's wonderful. But I wish it weren't such an exception. Another thing that I'm encouraged by is that Pando Populus is an organization I helped to found, but it is it has organized the chief sustainability officers of universities and businesses and so forth. And the chief sustainability officer of the county of Los Angeles is with it. And that organization has been interested in helping the county fulfill its 10 goals. I think it's 10. We've set 10 goals for a decade. They're excellent goals. They're just exactly what we need, except they give no indication whatsoever of how to achieve them. Okay. Now, the CSO task force has persuaded, not going to the top of the university or dealing with the faculty as whole, but finding some people, often in the design programs. I've discovered that the design programs are the place that are not afraid of being relevant. And so they found groups within these 10 universities or graduate programs that were willing to take one of these 10 goals and then do some thinking about how to realize it and come out with proposals. And this is all done on television now. It was a wonderful program, but that it was possible to find 10 institutions of higher education that ignored the value of the academic disciplines long enough to do something that might actually benefit humanity. It's very encouraging, you see. They're losing their, I'm hoping that they're losing their stranglehold, that it's okay to be relevant. It's okay to help the world. I know those are values, but they're not really controversial values. I don't think we need to be afraid of allowing somebody. One of the problems in our society is even the scientists don't value truth. And a society where there's not a high value on truth cannot survive. My first big disillusionment was when President Eisenhower, I think he was an honorable man. I'm not holding him up in any other way. But the Russians claimed they had shot down a US spy plane called the U-2. And he went on television and said, "We have no spy planes." 2 days later, the evidence was so clear that he had to go say, "We do have spy planes after all." Well, it was so obvious he was doing what he thought he needed to do because it would be better for people to believe falsehood. So he thought it was virtuous to lie to us. And one can say, all right, maybe so. But once you know that your leaders are lying to you whenever they think it's good for you to believe something false, communication becomes meaningless. So I'm afraid I'm rather cynical about both political parties in that respect. I think that the politicians running for office value success in getting office well above truth in the great majority of cases. I think it would be wonderful if in universities somehow we communicated the fact that truth is a value that should be subordinated to other values only in very special cases. But now, for example, the government has its scientists, and its scientists will support any theory that they're told to support. Okay, so they're scientists, but that doesn't mean that what they produce is based on evidence. It's based on what they think is good for the country. Well, science cannot expect us to have the kind of trust in it that we would like to have if it's up for sale in that way. That's another value I would really like to see the educational system. Now, on the other hand, they do teach, don't cheat on exams. I don't care how value-free they are, they'll flunk you out of school if they catch you cheating on an exam. So it's all, consistency is a rare virtue or vice. People are not consistently wrong either. So, but I don't think it would be difficult to come up with a set of values that 99% of the people of this country would not support. So the fact that we need to be value-free in the sense that a school system, which everyone is required to support through taxes, should not take sides on controversial issues. I think that's a good principle. But that it should not teach the value of kindness, or the value of getting along with other people, or the value of truth, or the value of generosity. That I don't think follows. And a society can't survive. And our society is coming very close to self-destruction right now. So I'm not talking about an abstract problem that might arise in the future. Every day the newspaper tells me to hate some people. And other people are being told to hate me. You know, we just have that society. We demonize each other. And I don't see anything going on in the curriculum of the university that works against that. I'm emphasizing the university. high schools are influenced very much by what happens in universities, because the high school professors have all gone to universities, and they have a strong sense that a successful high school gets its students into good colleges. And the good colleges are the ones that are most committed to academic disciplines. So there's a pressure downward, but fortunately, it doesn't get to kindergarten. That's why I think in kindergarten, the teaching is often wonderful. We had a set of whitehead kindergartens in Beijing. But once again, the parents, though the kids loved it and everything was fine, but the parents said they are supposed to be beginning their memorizing process by the age of 4. And we weren't teaching them. I mean, I think they learned some songs. I mean, in that sense, they memorized, but you know the kind of memorizing I'm talking about. One survived, and it's a wonderful experience to be there because the children are just flourishing, and they have some wonderful toys there. That the problem that the child confronts can only be solved if 2 or 3 children work together to solve it. There are not a lot of toys like that on the market, but there's a very ingenious work of that kind for children to learn that while having fun. I mean, you want to learn your lessons in a fun way, not as because you are punished if you don't do something. So anyway, the others closed because they weren't teaching the children to memorize. And memorization has become almost irrelevant. No one can memorize as much as they can have information as they can have it hold in their hand and look up very quickly if they need it. So to make memorization the goal of education is making us imitate computers, then we'll never catch up with them. So let's say they won that one. Now let's do the things that human beings do. That would be such a gain. You can tell I'm pretty extreme, and also I get emotional about these things. I'm watching the human race destroy itself, and I don't like it.
Are there any other questions for Dr. Cobb? Any other comments?
My question, if I may ask one more. So you say that academia, universities lost interest to find truth. Why? How did it happen?
Well, I blame everything on the academic disciplines. I'm sorry. But you see, I was at the University of Chicago in the years right after World War II. I was in the Army, and then I got out and and the University of Chicago was holding out against the academic disciplines. The president, who became chancellor, thought that the university should be the center of the intellectual life, and the scholarship of the academic disciplines is not intellectual. I mean, scholarship is one thing; intellectual activity is different. And I flourished in that context. I loved it. And the divinity school where I went was that kind of place. The dean told us our job was to figure out what we believed and why we believed it and be able to defend it. Okay, that's an intellectual activity. Now, in the process, of course, we needed to know something about the history of Christian thinking, and we needed to know something about other religions, and we need to, it's not that it reduces the amount you need to know in order to do the thinking, but the way you approach all of this information is different. You relate it to issues that are deeply important to you as a human being. And the academic disciplines came into the university. The chancellor gave up, left, and the man who was president under the chancellor was named Caldwell. And he went to Emory University. I'd been to a junior college of Emory University. I'm from Georgia. Emory is in Georgia. And there he set up a PhD program. He made the point I made a little while ago. Most of the colleges where people, graduates, PhDs will teach, call themselves liberal arts colleges. So they should be teaching liberal arts, but there were no PhD programs in liberal arts. There's a tension built in, very deep tension. So he created the Graduate Institute of Liberal Arts. And he brought me there. So I worked with him. I don't mean I didn't do other things, but I did. So you can understand this critique of the academic disciplines is existential in the sense I have experienced what they do. Well, unfortunately for Emory, Caldwell was set to become the new president, but the integration came along. And the noble trustees of Emory University said, since we are a Christian university, we don't have to integrate. And of course, Caldwell was not going to play that kind of a game. Anyway, he had come from the divinity school at Chicago to the presidency of the university, and he went back into theological education and became the first president of the School of Theology at Claremont. And he invited me to follow him here. That's why I'm in here. But my life is tied up with that change. The abandonment of intellectual issues. Intellectuals want to know what's behind, what's underneath, why these things are happening. Memorization has nothing to do with that. And there are still courses in critical thinking that do a little bit of that, but it's not part of any academic discipline to ask questions about the assumptions of the discipline. It used to be that there were courses in the history of science or the history of economics. There aren't anymore. Studying the history of any of these things makes you think about them and understand them in a different way. I mean, understanding that the compulsory public schools was designed to produce people for the industrial age has helped me to understand why they have the character they have. But if you don't know why anybody thought it was a good idea to require everybody to go to school, then you just, I mean, you don't know what you're looking at. It takes an intellectual approach to give you a real understanding of what's happening in the world. There's very little evidence of any intellectual life in the government of this country, I'm afraid. So I'm sad about some of the changes that's taking place. There are other good changes. I think in childcare, I think things are improving. I think my grandchildren are doing a much better job of bringing up their children than Jean and I did of bringing up our children. And it's because there's a much more understanding of the child's need. We thought the medical profession was the right thing to follow, so we followed it. But we now know it wasn't the right thing. I mean, I'm talking that in an extreme way with our twins, but our first son got a reputation already in the hospital for being the leader of, I mean, it was all funny. He was the one who made the most noise. In other words, he cried the loudest. I don't think letting him be there crying alone in a bassinet was a humane treatment of that child. So I feel guilty, but I mean, I don't feel guilty. I excuse myself. We thought we were doing the right thing when we did what we were told to do by the scientific advisors. But, and science has done so much good for the world. I don't want to be anti-science. But the guilds, scientific guilds, restrict science. They excommunicate their best members. They are less tolerant than the church ever was. I've been closely associated with Herman Daly. He was an economist who, from my point of view, had the good sense to see that it's not a good idea to devote all the energies to increasing consumption at a time that we realize the resources of the earth are limited. There must be some better goal, because all that meant is you would shorten the duration of the time that people could live on the earth. Well, Herman wrote about that. He said, growth, endless growth is not the God that we thought it was. And therefore, the whole guild turned against it. The economists will not even use his name. In economic writings, in the writings of the economists, I sometimes see reference to his ideas, but they won't mention him. Now that's what is known as erasure. That goes way beyond just excommunication. Now, he was lucky because the environmentalists embraced him. And at that time, there was in Washington, there was a strong environmentalist influence. And there were people who protested that the World Bank was not doing environmental impact studies on the projects. And the World Bank was under pressure. And so they hired Herman Daly. Well, they put him, he's married to a Brazilian woman, speaks Portuguese. So they put him on the Brazil desk. But the Brazilians didn't want him to be evaluating their projects. So he got kicked upstairs. No country wanted him to be evaluating their projects because they all wanted the money. But so it was, in a way, it was good. He was kicked upstairs to deal with general issues. So we wrote a book together. He got more invitations to speak around the world than anybody else at the World Bank. So there is a community outside of the guilds that is open to hearing new things, but not within the guilds. I can give you lots more examples, but I don't. Just this morning, we had a meeting we have a meeting every morning at every Tuesday morning at 10. And the speaker today is a man who's working in an organization devoted to trying to get the left and the right to undo the damage they're doing by lying about each other. He agreed. I mean, really wonderful. But he was pointing out that he correctly understands that we humans need to be part of a group. It's a deep human need. And he said people on the left often think, oh, no, they don't do that. But he was saying, well, and he took the example of physics. And he pointed out that very recently there is a woman physicist who does not agree with most of the physicists on fairly technical issues, important issues, and who thinks that it is, well, I won't go into detail, but in other words, she's not orthodox. Orthodoxy changes from time to time, but changes collectively. And right now, her views are not orthodox, so she's treated really cruelly by the other physicists. She is excommunicated. But this is not a rare event, I'm just saying. The guilds encourage this kind of orthodoxy. They discourage questioning of any fundamental principles, and they certainly just discourage anybody from disagreeing. And the people who do care more for truth than they do for being well paid and secure and appreciated by their colleagues, they pay the price.
They're systematically eliminated. They are systematically eliminated.
Yes, they are systematically eliminated from the guild, yes. Lynn Margulis was another wonderful woman, in her case a biologist, who demonstrated a fundamental mistake in neo-Darwinism. You've all heard, again and again, I'm sure, the idea that we have random mutation and natural selection, and that explains everything. Well, she pointed out that that wasn't the way the eukaryotic cell came into being. I think there's no more important step in the evolutionary process than the emergence of the kind of cell of which our bodies are composed, and all animals are composed. But it did not come into being in the way in which the orthodox evolutionists said it should have. And she demonstrated that. And finally, they had to agree with her. But they also cut off the money for experiments because she thought there were a lot of other things that happened that way. But part of the orthodoxy is that everything happens by competition. And she thought things happen just as much by cooperation as by competition. Not acceptable. And even today, they still repeat the old phrase, even though it has been disproved at a very, very important point. If they would just say, often it happens that way, they'd be right. But they won't allow an exception, but nevertheless, they have to admit it. It is a very incoherent situation, very hard on people who would like truth. I don't think truth matters much. I'm a little cynical. You might get picked that up by now.
I'm not sure you are a little cynical. I think you are not cynical enough.
Okay. Yeah. If you push me, you might find I'm more cynical than I'm admitting.
I wouldn't call it cynical. I think we need to look to and face really honestly where we are.
Yes.
And sometimes it's perceived as cynicism, but what we need is exactly to see things the way they are. And actually, I put in the chat a couple more links which maybe are helpful in this direction. One of them is of Ronin Institute. I don't know if anybody heard here about Ronin Institute, which are trying to create new scientific institution outside of the existing one.
I see.
So if you look in the chat, you will see
A
that link
new,
there.
okay, thank you. A new educational institution or what scientific institution?
The institution that would be focused and dedicated to finding what is true.
Oh, okay.
So it's a research institution.
Oh, good. No, I'm glad I will find it in trash because I'm seriously looking for the hopeful things. I like to picture something attractive possibilities. And so that's why I spend time thinking about what education could be like that would be more enjoyable for teachers, much healthier for students, better for society. I think if you understand there are possibilities of that kind, that can be a motivation rather than just fear. There's plenty to be afraid of, but I think that's not a helpful emphasis. I think we better quit that, Joseph.
Well, that's fine and good. John, we're so super appreciative, as always, of your time and your insight. You know, again, a lot of the things that we do around here wouldn't have really shaken out the way that they have without some of that insight. And like I said at the top of this, some of your permissions and allowing us to kind of think about things in a different way. You know, hearing it from you, hearing it from somebody who's at the pinnacle, at the top of that mountain of education, and looking down on it and saying, you know, maybe there was a different way to climb up this whole thing in the first place. I think that carries a lot of weight and gives us all a lot to think about. So thank you all for coming.
Yes.
If you want to find out more about John and you have a Google him, and hopefully carry a fire extinguisher next to you in case your computer starts to kick on fire, because there's plenty out there about him. But thank you all for coming. And we'll look forward to doing this hopefully again next year.